Hello and welcome to No Nonsense and welcome to 2024. I read just the other day that the word of the year for 23 was authentic. So we're going to talk about what that really means. We're also going to look at the fact that we are apparently in yet another age of anxiety. I think we've always been there. Elections in the US, UK, possibly here. Everyone is fearing for the future of democracy. And again, it reminds me of the words of a philosopher who said that the death of democracy is not likely to be an assassination or an ambush. It will be slow extinction from apathy, indifference, and undernourishment. So to Darrell Bricker now, the global CEO of IPSOS Public Affairs, global polling company Market Research, frequent commentator and author of a dozen books. And it's always great to have you here. Happy New Year and welcome.
Well, thank you, Senator. Thanks for having me on. Happy New Year to you and to your listeners.
Does authentic bother you the way it bothers me? Everybody talking about their authentic this and that.
Yeah, it's not a new one. I remember hearing people talking about authenticity back in the 1990s. I mean, it's not a particularly new idea, but I think that what they're saying with the word authentic is not necessarily that anything was authentic, but the search is for authenticity.
Yeah.
That what people are actually looking for is something that's genuine out there, something they can actually believe. And in this world of AI, where heaven knows I could be AI generated right now, or you could be AI generated.
Exactly.
What is authentic anymore?
Yeah, that's, I think, what I was reacting to. And the other thing was, we're talking, and we'll get into this a little bit, about how each subsequent generation, X's and millennials and Y's and Z's and all the rest of them, are suffering from anxiety in a way that other generations haven't before. But then I ran across this reference to the fact that W.H. Auden had been writing about the age of anxiety in 1947. So it too has been around forever, this dealing with anxiety. Are you feeling it, seeing it, sensing it in a different way?
Well, I think, you can look at it in different contexts. I mean, I think the real anxiety that people are expressing right now in Canada is very much related to their immediate circumstances, and the difficulties that they're experiencing just getting by from day to day. I mean, we've never had housing appear as a top issue on our surveys in terms of top public concern. It was always, below the top 10. It would always be like number 15, and it was always about people feeling that lower income individuals weren't able to access housing, and that there was a apparent homeless problem in cities. Not apparent, a real homeless problem in cities.
Right.
Now we've got middle class people saying, I can't get the type of housing that I feel that I've entitled to, even though I feel I've done everything right. I'm not destitute, but I'm not achieving to the level that I thought I would be achieving at this stage of my life. And they're very concerned about that. For younger people, even looking at because when you look at the people who are the most anxious about this, the people who tend to be from the age of about 35 to about 55. So people who are in that kind of prime earning years of their lives, not being able to achieve things. Well, the next generation coming through, their kids are living with all of that, and also asking the same questions about what their future is going to be. So there's anxiety associated with that. And you've got older people, of course, concerned about whether or not they're going to be able to make it by on fixed income. So there's a lot of free-flowing anxiety that exists in Canada just around economic conditions. And I haven't even mentioned anything about politics.
Yeah, no, exactly. And I was just talking to an economist friend of mine today, very well respected, who just said, look, prognosis for 2024 is not good, economically speaking. So, when you're in the midst of election years, certainly in the US, maybe here as well, but you get those mixed messages all the time. We're going to make it better. It's going to be a great year. The guys that are in the job have to defend it and say the country's doing so much better than it was under someone else. But in fact, the numbers belie that. It's just not true.
Well, it is a question of numbers for people who are more sophisticated about this, and they can look over the long term. And if you go on any social media site and you see economists talking about this, they'll show you how things were, 10 years ago, 15 years ago. People aren't really engaged in that. What they know is when they go to the grocery store or they get their mortgage statement, or they get their rent statement, or they get just about anything related to taxes these days, they're saying, "Oh my God, I don't know how I'm going to be able to get through this."
Yeah.
And we've got a lot of, in fact, we had a survey that we put out today that showed, a majority of Canadians don't know that they could find $1,000 if they had an emergency expense these days. So you sit back and you say, that's precarious.
Yeah, that is. And I have this discussion with friends. I mean, I spent Christmas in Saskatchewan. We can have the whole discussion about what the carbon tax has meant to people there, but it's ripping money out of their pockets. And I don't care what any politician says, it's a huge, huge cost to people. People who had ham, a small ham for Christmas instead of a turkey. And turkey used to be one of the cheapest foods you can get, and now they just couldn't afford that. Like, this is very real. This is not, should I have two heads of lettuce or one? This is basic stuff.
Yeah, and Canadians, that's what's driving them these days. So there's a lot of things that are of tremendous interest to the media, for example, that get a lot of coverage, but this day-to-day stuff seems kind of boring. And you don't see a
Yeah,
lot of it. You'll see the macroeconomic statistics reported, but the actual struggle that people are going through
yeah,
today, and they're telling us on our surveys, is not just short-term economic concern; it's existential. It's about this idea that the progress that I thought I would be making in my life, I'm not making, and in fact, I feel like I'm sliding back, and I'm really worried about what this is going to mean. Say, for example, if you have kids, what their
yeah,
situation is going to be, because if they're not feeling positive about themselves, they're certainly feeling less positive about their kids, and so as these things compound over time, as the economy is not specifically improving, although we're seeing some better signs in the United States, for example, and maybe some other parts of the world. In Canada right now, our economic confidence numbers are way below where they were even 3 years ago. So
yeah,
economic confidence isn't about the macro economy or what a politician says. It's about whether or not I feel like I can afford to get a turkey this year, or
yeah.
whether I'm dreading when my next credit card bill comes through the front door. And there's a lot of people who are feeling all of those things right now.
And a lot of the conversations I had, and I think you've been sensing this as well, because the Prime Minister keeps saying it, and certainly in his year-end speeches, that diversity is our strength. But in fact, it's really a cause for unease, because we're now seeing that not just refugee or immigration numbers, but the migrant numbers are going up as well. And that's putting the pressure on things like housing for the first time. Certainly in my memory, people are connecting those two issues directly.
Yeah, it is a wonderful thing that Canada has been able to absorb as many immigrants over the years as they have been, or as we have been, as successfully as we have. But what really concerns me, Senator, is that we can't take that for granted. In
Right.
fact, diversity isn't, it's a strength when you achieve it over time, but it's also a weakness if you don't do it well. And
Yeah.
that's what concerns me. And what's happening on immigration these days is that there's always been an element in Canadian society that's been anti-immigrant. It's not been a majority element that's been anti-immigrant, but
Yeah.
it's been there. But what's happened over the space of the last 2 years is that reasonable people who normally wouldn't have a problem with immigration now have a rational reason to be opposed to it. And it could come across as being opposed to the immigrants, them, as individuals, from
Yeah.
where they,
Yeah.
they come from. That would be a wrong interpretation. What their concern is with is the numbers of them and the effect that they believe it's happening on their ability to be able to buy, for example, a home.
Yeah.
So a rational person who's not doesn't have the usual problems with immigration that are more nativist related can come to the conclusion that it's a bad thing for Canada because of the economic pressure they feel in their lives, whether it's real or not. They now have somebody to blame, and the government has a real challenge in managing that well.
Yeah, I mean, I think everybody understands that we're a country of immigrants and we need immigrants and we need skilled immigrants. And I think also as a country have always believed that we should accept refugees, that we have a social responsibility to do that. But we're dealing with another group of people here. When you have a kind of a million extra people come in, or students don't go home, or we're now talking about increasing the number of Palestinians coming in, and Canadians are seeing what's happening on their streets, which is violence and hatred. That really starts to change the lens through which you look at this issue.
Yeah, part of the deal for acceptance in Canada is that you leave those things behind.
Yeah,
You come in and you invest yourself in what the Canadian experience is, which has been one in which there have been constant waves of immigration that have built our population. But at the moment, we face such a population challenge in this country because our fertility rates have collapsed. We're now recording the lowest fertility rates in history. We're not producing children in Canada the way that we used to. That the only
yeah.
way that you can balance off the increasing age of the population is through some form of immigration. When you try and bring in younger people, it's a very short-term solution and is absolutely imperfect, but it is one way of trying to address it. So you need to have a positive overall perspective among the Canadian population about immigration. And if what's happening is because of the economic situation that we're facing, combined with, as I said before, people not living up to the obligation that you have when
Right,
you come to
right.
Canada of leaving those problems behind, you start creating an environment in which reasonable people can be opposed to immigration. And that's
So
an incredibly destructive problem.
is this something that can be, are the numbers themselves, I mean, which it appears are having this impact on housing, that we just didn't get ready for the number of people we invited in or allowed in or turned a blind eye to them coming? Is that kind of the issue, or could it be ameliorated by the politicians talking about it in a different way and being realistic, being honest about what they're doing? I mean, we see this in a dramatic way in the US, the people coming across the southern border by the, 300,000 last month, right? It was just a crazy, crazy number for which they are not ready. They don't have facilities and homes and all of that kind of stuff. So, but still you hear from the White House that everything's okay. They've got it under control. So do we just need to be honest with the public? Would that help? Or is it is just a very real problem unto itself?
Well, as we've seen over the years, and anybody who's watched this in terms of public opinion over the years knows that Canadian support for immigration is predicated on the basis that they believe that the system is fair and is working well, and it's serving
Yeah,
Canada's national interest. At the moment, they don't feel that.
they don't believe that. Right.
So,
Okay.
it's different from Roxham Road that we were going through a few years
Yeah.
ago, in which people felt that there was a whole bunch of people that were cheating and were
Yes.
causing problems because they weren't following the rules that we're supposed to have for moving into Canada and becoming a Canadian. So they had issues with that, and you saw the government's numbers around immigration really suffer, and you actually saw the popularity of the government suffer too.
Yeah.
But this time around, it seems not to be about that. What it seems to be about is people feeling that the absolute numbers are out of control, and that they really don't understand why this is required. And the that this has kind of sprung up out of the ground almost
Yes.
instantaneously is
Where did
something
this
that,
idea come from? Why are
yeah,
we doing this now?
yes, but it's one of those things where I think governments like to announce numbers, but
Yeah.
don't know, because that's the easiest thing to do. But then actually putting in place at all three levels of government, by the way, the capabilities to be able to deal with this influx of people, nobody seems to have done a very good job of it, at least from the perspective of Canadians. I'm not an expert on immigration policy. I'm not an expert
Right.
on
Right.
what's happening on the street with immigrations. I can only talk to you about what the public perceptions are, and the public
Yes, exactly.
perceptions have moved from positive to negative.
Yeah. And I mean, I think the other thing is that we've got such a different attitude in terms of work. I mean, we've still got a whole chunk of the population that is, quote, working from home. Would not clear why, even though employers are saying you have got to come back. And then they're saying, don't want this job anymore.
Well, it's kind of hard to in the private sector for people to take a position on this that's um, asking people to come back to the office after the government's just made a settlement with its biggest union
Right.
saying that you can work from home. I mean, you
Yeah.
negotiated and the rest of it. Okay, so you've now created the environment in which everybody feels that they can make that distinction. But we're never going to go back to working in the office as we used to. We're going to move into some sort of, and we are moving into some sort of hybrid sort of situation. And for individual people, probably a good thing. For businesses, there's a lot of arguments that it might be a bad thing, particularly for people who feel that they're losing their corporate culture or that they can't get the level of productivity that they need out of their investment in their staff, and also for people who are younger, for example, being able to actually get effectively onboarded into new jobs and get the kind of training that they feel that they need to have successful careers. So there's all sorts of challenges to that. But as I even say in our own company, why does that challenge equals real estate? I mean,
Mhm.
there's two items on it. Most companies, balance sheet that costs them a lot of money. One of them is people, the other one's real estate, and one of them
Yeah.
makes you money. So,
Yeah.
if you can save some money on real estate, you're probably going to. But the most interesting thing for me on all of this is how completely ineffective major cities in this country have been in terms of dealing with this problem and whistling past the graveyard on it. I'm deathly afraid of what's going to happen to downtown Toronto as a result of this
Yeah.
trend. And the city
Yeah.
of Toronto has done nothing but made it harder for people to get in and out of this city. What's the
Yeah.
incentive for anybody to come downtown? I mean, why would you
No,
want to
it's a
do something
nightmare.
else?
And
Why would you?
yeah.
And so,
Yeah.
what's going to happen to the tax base in this city is something that's very concerning. It's already hitting in a place like Ottawa. I mean, who
Yeah.
comes if you don't have to come downtown to Ottawa? I mean, you got an LRT that doesn't work. Why would you take that? I
Right.
mean, if you could work from home, and by the way, now allowed to by the federal government, why wouldn't that be the way you would decide to work? And the huge amount of hiring that's been going on from the federal government has been reported more directly over the last couple of days. Says the federal government's a pretty good place to work for people these days, especially in the national capital region. Why they don't have to go
Yeah.
downtown?
Well, that was part of what my economist friend was saying, which is we haven't even seen the impact yet on the economy of the real estate hit when nobody goes to the big towers downtown anymore or office buildings anywhere. Who's going to buy it and to what end? You can't convert a lot of that stuff into condos for the influx of population. They're just not built that way.
Well, the what's going to happen, and it's already happening, is it's not going to be we're all downtown or we're all not.
Yeah.
It started off with okay, 3 days a week. Maybe we all have to be away during COVID, but now as we're coming
Yeah.
back, maybe it's 3 days a week, maybe it's 2 days a week. And as I say to people when we talk about this all the time, okay, well, 2 days out of five is 40%.
Yeah.
So
That's
everything
right.
that's around there, 1 day out of five is 20. So um, if that type of economic activity isn't happening around downtown and you don't need the same amount of space, well, it's not that you're going to
Yeah.
shut down your space, but instead of having three floors, you're going to have one
Yeah.
or two. And all of these little cuts are the things that are going to have their effect. And that's what the problem is going to be for places like downtown Toronto. And the pressure will not be for people to come back to the office. The pressure will be, can I take three back to two? And it's not
Yes.
all going to happen
Never mind my
instantaneously. It's going
lease.
to be
Yeah.
all these little,
Yeah.
people are going to chip away at it. And the problem that we have for a place like downtown Ottawa or downtown Toronto is they'll say, okay, well, that's great. We're going to convert these condos and this into condos, as you've already said. And it's like,
Yeah.
but even better, we're going to have it for, affordable condos for low income people. It's like, they can't replace the business taxes you're going to lose. And we
Right.
know if you're making it for affordable people, the one thing that they don't have is money. So what's the tax
Yeah.
base to support all of this? downtown. And that's when it all starts to crumble. And it's not going to
And
happen
there's
right
no,
away, a little bit by little bit.
yeah. But all those little businesses, the fast food and the dry cleaners and everything that's associated with the big office towers also can't sustain. So even if you do condoize these things, then there are no services there for people anyway. You don't have a grocery store.
Yeah, they're going to move to Nepean. And
Yeah,
they're going to move to, Merrickville. They're going to do
yeah,
other stuff. They're going to go where their
yeah,
customers are, and they're going to follow the money. And the problem is that the people going downtown are the laptop workers. They're people who are,
yeah,
middle class strivers, people who actually have the money, and they're prepared to spend the money in businesses around there, whether it's having lunch or getting their dry cleaning done, or going to
yeah,
the hairdressers or whatever. They're the people who support that. They have the cash to be able to do it, and that's what drives the economy in these places. It's not going to be people living in low income housing. I mean, it's just not going to
yeah,
happen. And we also have this kind of Jane Jacobs view of what the downtown should be. Very diverse and all these walk ups
yes.
and highly dense and all the rest of it. And it's like, yeah, except Jane Jacobs lived at a time in which downtowns were hellholes, first of all.
Yeah,
And
yeah,
secondly, there were no public services at all. There
yeah,
were none. So you lived there because that's where you could afford to live, and you relied on your friends, families, churches, volunteer groups, and that kind of thing, because there was no government services. But now we have massive levels of government services that somebody has to pay for, starting with transit. And by the way, the fastest shrinking communities in Canada right now are usually the people in more remote parts of the country, but in urban parts of the country are people who live in transit commuting suburbs. Actually, car driving commuting suburbs are getting bigger. Right downtown
yeah.
is getting bigger. And even growing more than that are people who are living outside of what is normally considered to be the car commuting zone. So they're living in ex-urban areas. There's a report that came out about that last week, and it's absolutely fascinating. So all
Interesting.
of these
Yeah.
things are the effects that are going to happen, and you and I are just about the only people talking about them, Senator.
It's just, I mean, that whole shift and you combine that with the other issues where we tend to, and you and I've talked about this before, the kind of the shift where we tend to live amongst ourselves, that we're seeing. We find people that reflect our own views and our own values, and so we seek out areas like that. A lot of that's economic, but some of that's ideological as well.
Yeah, and so you can see it in voting patterns in Canada, how downtowns vote versus how suburbs vote versus how small
Yeah.
town and rural communities vote. And what it's led to is a completely different way of winning elections in this country. And that's why John Ibbitson and I wrote The Big Shift, because the old idea that all
Yeah.
you needed to do was unite Canada and unite Canada by getting Quebec and uh, enough of Ontario to vote together that you would form a majority government is no longer the only way to win an election in this country. If you win in the
Yeah.
West and you weren't in the car commuting suburbs, you win too.
But now we are, to our earlier point, into the era of diaspora politics as well, right? You're just finding those communities of support inside diaspora communities and picking some side or the other, or some portion of that community or the other, and trying to put those kinds of coalitions together. Again, also quite urban based generally.
Yeah, I think that there's a certain amount of that. I think it's probably more relevant in things like leadership campaigns and maybe
Yeah,
in
okay.
nomination meetings in particular ridings.
Yeah,
But the interesting thing is, downtown ridings don't decide elections in this country. Suburban ridings decide
yeah,
elections. And it's very interesting what happens to people, even from ethnic communities that move out into those places. And by the way, they're not moving out to them right now. That's where they're starting. They develop middle class values very similar to the people already living there. So to just treat them as being, from a particular community, but not recognizing that they have all the same issues that the person who may have ancestors in this country that go back a century or whatever,
yeah,
well,
yeah.
they probably share more in common with that than they do with somebody living downtown in the
If the roads don't
diaspora.
work and the price of food is too high, it's still the same
Yeah,
problem.
yeah, exactly.
Yeah. All right, let's jump into politics and where we are, because there is this question about, what the prime minister is going to do. He says repeatedly he's staying and he's in for the long haul, and that his party either which way, you stay and pay the price because you've taken the numbers down, or we think you're such a great retail politician, you could win again. But underlying all of that too is kind of his hope that I think what happens in the United States in their electoral campaign may really affect the climate here. So he wants to see how that plays out. Do you agree with that, or is it just something he might not be able to wait for?
If you've got a thread to pull, that's a pretty good one, but it's a thread.
Yeah.
I mean, I
Okay.
think the problem that the prime minister has is he's not a new force in Canadian politics. And what makes you strong makes you weak in this game too. So back in 2015,
Yeah.
he was it. And now the problem is he's still it, but
Yeah.
people's views of him have changed. So this sense that he's, a magnificent campaigner, I think, as more people see of him these days, actually the less they like him. So
Yeah.
I
Yeah.
don't know that that adds up. And leaving it all in the hands of what Americans are going to decide in their election campaign. Well, what if Joe Biden wins?
Yeah.
I mean,
Then
what are
you
you going
don't
to do
have the
there?
trump card to play that I'm the only bulwark to save democracy in the West, et cetera, et cetera.
And by the way, why would anybody see him as the best bulwark to do it? It's not like Donald
Yeah.
Trump likes him, or
Yeah. No, no,
that
exactly.
in these days that he's taken particularly seriously by our Americans, even with the current administration. I mean, so
Yeah.
it's well, they may be right. That may be, but I think that this is a strategy of convenience when you run out of everything else. The
Do
fundamental
you
problem that they have is that leadership was what they were about. Leadership, their leader was what they were about. The agenda that he personified when it was popular was very popular. Now that it's unpopular, it's very unpopular, and
yeah.
people want change. And when you're in a change environment, it's very difficult to present yourself as the change. That's what he's
And
facing.
is it so it's not so much, and I don't know, you tell me, is it really about embracing Pierre Poilievre and the conservatives and it's time to clean up the books, so we always go to conservatives, or what's
No,
the actual mindset?
well, it's about change. And the thing about
Yeah,
Poilievre, I mean, he's ahead of the prime minister on best prime minister, but Poilievre's numbers are not like Justin Trudeau's were back in 2015.
right.
I
Yeah.
mean, there's a lot of people who really don't like Pierre Poilievre. But the thing about you're mentioning the word authentic, the thing
Yes.
that Poilievre's got going for him is he comes across authentically as different,
Yeah.
as change. So the more that the liberals stand up and hammer him because he's not this and he's not that and he's going to be this or he's going to be that and try to create that difference, the problem that the liberals have is they're actually making Poilievre's point.
If you
That
want change, he's the guy because he's
yeah,
different.
if you want change,
Yeah.
he's the guy. And by the way, if he upsets you, then he must really be
Yeah.
the right thing. So that's what Poilievre has going for him. It's not that people look at him. I mean, there's a constituency of Canadians that's maybe about a third of Canadians who actually really like him, but most Canadians are either ambiguous or don't like him. But it's not about that. It's
So
really
it's
about the
it's
incumbent.
it's throwing the bums out and getting some new bums. That's kind of what we do.
Yeah, and so the prime minister's basically got three options. One of them is he can do what he says he plans to do, which is hang around for 2 years. There's no sign on the horizon at all that things will get any better. He's kind of like the same position that Sunak finds himself in the UK, where it's
Yeah.
just people have made up their mind. They're just counting down the clock and getting more frustrated that the change isn't coming faster. So
Yeah.
he's got that's
I
going
get
for
that
him.
sense here too, that it's almost people feel that he owes them an election, that Trudeau owes them an election. He knows people are unhappy, and so let us do something about it. It's very hard to exercise your free will in a country. When you get your shot once every 4 years or once every 3 years.
Yeah, we just did a poll showing a majority of Canadians wanted to have an election. By the way, a third of Liberal supporters and a third of
Yeah,
Liberal supporters want the Prime Minister gone too. I mean,
yeah,
and remember, they're down to their core. They're down like 25, and
yeah,
a third of those want the Prime Minister to go. The other ones have already switched. As I said, he's got three options. One of them is he can, do the 12 corner bank shot or whatever to try and come up with a strategy. And, hopefully Poilievre stumbles or something
yeah,
happens
yeah,
between now and October 2025. The other option he has is he can resign. It's
Yeah.
what his father did. By the way, it's what Brian Mulroney did too when he was in a similar situation. And
Yeah.
Mulroney's numbers were this bad as well. And then
Yeah.
the third option he's got is he can call an election.
Yeah. And
It's
just
force the question.
take his chances. If he thinks that he can beat Poilievre, then you know, be true to your beliefs and take on the challenge.
And the opportunity he has is to define what the election question is about and to control the timing,
Yeah.
which is what he doesn't have if he waits till October 2025. Now, Stephen Harper did the similar kind of thing back in 2015 and ended up losing the election, but Harper was competitive. Trudeau's
Yes.
not competitive right now. His numbers, his
Yeah.
personal numbers are terrible. And depending on the poll that you look and the day that you look, he's anywhere from 10 to 15 points behind the Conservatives. And you don't win from there.
With you say, and it's a really interesting point that, you know, the more the Liberals say of Poilievre and the Conservatives that he's the enemy, he's MAGA North, he's this and that, they are also creating that whole argument, which is if you want change, this is your change candidate. But you've also said that Poilievre has some issues. There's people that don't like him. So what does he do? Does he just hammer away as the leader of the opposition and criticize everything that comes by? Does he lay out a different plan? Like what 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 are Canadians telling you about what they want from this change person?
You know, there's two schools of thought on this. One of them is the kind of the Jean Chrétien school of thought, or the common sense revolution. You know, when Mike Harris ran in
Yeah.
1995 and became Premier of Ontario. And there's other leaders who've done it. Chrétien with his Red Book, you know, that what you have to do is you have to put out, and Trudeau did the same thing, you know, put out a big policy platform and, you know, that fills in the blanks for people and tells you what they're going to want and you're going to do. The problem is that people don't necessarily believe what you're saying in the election campaign is what you're going to do anyway. So there's not a lot of credibility around these documents at the moment. The second thing is other perspective is that, you know, why would you change what's working for you? I mean, Poilievre
Yeah.
is doing really well because of what he's doing. The only people clamoring for a policy platform are his opponents and journalists.
Correct.
It's not like the
Yeah.
average Canadian is saying, I have not seen Pierre Poilievre's platform. You know, what is, so, I mean, it's working for him. I don't know that there's a need to change. Now, by the way, my view hasn't always been that. I thought I've felt that Poilievre should have done something that's more substantive on policy, but what for?
Yeah.
At this stage of the game, he's, you know, as I said before, 10 to 15 points ahead, and nobody's asked him other than a columnist in the Toronto Star or someplace,
Yeah.
or one of his opposition, you know, during question period, somebody in the opposition saying, "What are you going to do when you're in government?" It's like, well, you're the only one asking. Why do I have to say anything?
And he has put a few things out there, like axe the tax is a pretty simple, straightforward. We don't have all the details of it, but we know what he means.
Yeah, it's so there's some red meat stuff that really appeals to people who are really motivated by that. So, you know, getting rid of the CBC and things like that,
Yeah. Yeah.
that he's put out there. But, you know, a red book or a common sense revolution, I mean, maybe he can do it at some point, but at the moment, it's not like people are flocking away from him because they're worried about what he's going to do when he becomes prime minister, at least not at this stage. They just want
Yeah.
change. It's like Rob Ford against George Smitherman and Barbara Hall. Who is the biggest hand grenade we can throw at this thing to
Yeah.
blow it up? Because we hate what's
Yeah.
going on. And that's the people who are flocking to Poilievre, that's their motivation.
You take the pulse literally on a daily basis here and in other countries as well. So two things. I want to come back to when did it go off the rails for Justin Trudeau, but first I want to ask you about when did it go off the rails for Canada, where we simply seem to be losing our status in the world, our reputation, all of those things. People are, you know, not calling us for the meetings anymore.
Well, there's two parts to that. There's the kind of the engagement with the decision-making structures of the world. And there may be an issue there, but, you know, we put out our Halifax International Security Forum survey every year in which we go and we look at
Yeah.
the reputations of countries, and Canada is at the top of the list still. I mean,
Okay.
people, if you go out and you ask global citizens what they think about Canada, they still have really positive impressions. Now, what's it based on? Not very much. They think it's a clean place, a nice place, a place when you go out and you ask people, would this be a place to move, you'd like to move to if you had a chance to move to? Yeah, a lot of people still feel that way. So Canada's reputation as a country and as a people still remains very strong in the world. I don't know if that attaches itself to the government, but the Canadian government in most countries, other than, for example, India these days, most
Yes.
countries don't really think about the Canadian government or know that much about them. Justin Trudeau had a pretty positive reputation, I think, in most countries. And you saw this with people like Tony Blair or Bill Clinton or Barack Obama, even when they weren't doing necessarily that great at home. They seem to be doing better in other
Better
places, but
yeah.
I don't know that that necessarily matters very much. But I think the global impressions of Canada are actually remain quite positive. What happens in the halls of power in the world may be a different story, but I can't claim to be an expert on that.
Yeah, that's just the stuff, if it is Five Eyes becoming Four Eyes, there's just been a couple of groups. We're not pulling our weight on the defense issue, and we've heard it again from a military person this week, basically saying we haven't even delivered on the stuff we promised a year ago, and we're still running around saying that we've got your back and we're there till the end of time, but we're not delivering.
I'm reading John Ibbotson's book, The Duel.
Yes,
If you haven't read
it's
it,
a
any
great
of you,
book. No, yeah,
yeah, I was talking to him about it yesterday, because John and I write a lot together,
yes, yeah,
and uh, um, I'm reading it, and it's a lot of stuff seems very familiar. We
yes,
weren't pulling our weight back at the time of the Diefenbaker got rid of the Avro Arrow. So
yeah,
I mean, it's been going on for a very long time. So I don't think that's specifically related to this government. Canada's have had trouble being able to back its particularly its NATO commitments for quite a while, and it's not specifically this government that's at the root
yeah.
of it.
So you and I share an interest in the military, and it does seem like there is, there's been some announcements which seem positive, but they're 10, 15, 20 years out. Real problems recruiting, trying to impose the diversity culture on the military impacts people's willingness to join or stay. We've got some issues there.
Yeah, it'll be interesting to see what happens over time. The recruiting issue is a combination of demographic change
Yeah,
and also some reputational issues, probably in the military.
yeah,
I don't think that there's any way to deny that. I mean, the military has not gone through a particularly good period over the last,
yeah,
you can pick your period of time, let's say the last decade. And a lot of it self-inflicted. But the reputation of Canadian soldiers is actually still very high.
yes,
Um,
that's exactly
so
right. Yeah,
the institutions suffered, but the people who serve in the military, beyond the general staff and the senior leaders, when people think about the average Canadian sailor or aircrew or soldier, they have positive impressions of what they are. But the demographic challenge we have is that the median age of Canada today is 41, 42.
yeah,
Um, the ability to find a way into a very diverse community, not just in terms of gender, but also in terms of ethnic background. So, the foreign-born population of Canada is, moving up to a quarter. I mean,
yeah,
most of the military installations that we have in this country, none of them are really in major cities. They are in some cities like Halifax and other places, but
yeah,
um, there's a need for the military to find a way to get into this younger generation, because that's who tends to join the military, and they're not necessarily seen as a place where people want to
yeah,
go. And so there's a combination of things, which is, I think the military is in a lot of the wrong places, so people can't really see what they do because they're too remote. And then the second thing is, the need for diversity. There's a diversity necessity. Yes, there's a certain amount that can be done on gender, absolutely, but also people coming from different communities that
yeah,
that may not necessarily have a high regard for the military, particularly urban communities and especially suburban communities, because that's where the population is growing in this country. So the military needs to confront that. But then the other issue the military has is it's still based on a system in which somebody who turns 60 years old is now all of a sudden you're out.
Yes.
And the way that we evaluate whether or not people can provide valuable service is whether they can pass a physical test.
Yeah. Run
And
fast.
yeah, and you sit back and say, well, there's a certain amount of that needs to take place, but I'm seeing an awful lot of drone warfare, cybersecurity issues, other types of things that don't require you to be able to go out and
Yeah.
dig a ditch and sleep in it for 72 hours. So,
And maybe we need some gray hair, people who've been through
yeah.
this 1 or 2 or 3 or 6 times in the world. It's, as you say, nothing's okay. I wandered off there. So I want to come back and have you divine the
Oh,
Canadian psyche there and say what you heard and saw about when the bloom came off the rose for Justin Trudeau, because he was this, 2015 and the new young guy and the socks and the floppy hair, and there was going to be a whole change in our attitude. And now all of those things are, as you say, when people look at him, they get mad at him.
yeah. He kind of went around what I call the circle of D's. I'm not saying that because my name is Darrell, but starts off with darling, goes to disappointment,
Yes.
and now has come around to genuine dislike and depart. They've kind of gone around the whole circle.
That is a
And
very, very, very good description. The circle of D's. Okay,
and
got it.
where it went sideways for him was a combination of two things. One of them was SNC-Lavalin,
Yeah,
and
trust issue.
the second one was his trip to India.
Yeah.
So if you
It
go back and
really
you look
is.
at the polling, you go back and take a look at the polling, you just see where it happened. And he was doing really well in this one. Boom. And combined with that was the decline of Canadian optimism. It's not now. It started around 2018. Prior to the 2019 election, it started then. So by the time we got to the 2018 election or 2019 election, he was already in trouble.
Yeah.
And he lost the popular vote in that election, but won the election. 2021, he actually went into that election with a pretty good lead and burned it off. Again, losing the popular vote, but winning the election. Now, doesn't look like he's in a position to do either.
Yeah.
So if you go back to when it happened, it was right then, prior to the
Okay, so
pandemic.
let's just drill down a little bit if we can. So blackface didn't seem to bother anybody
Oh,
that
it did.
much.
No, that's all part
It
of
did?
disappointment.
Okay.
That's all part of disappointment.
Okay, that's part of that. But you're saying costumes in India. So is the difference he wasn't prime minister with blackface, but costumes in India was an embarrassment for all of us.
People thought it was ridiculous.
Yeah. Okay.
And it came across as ridiculous. I know it was very well intended. They were trying to show the fact that the Indian culture is such an important part of Canadian culture now. One
Yeah.
of the biggest diasporas in the country, if not the biggest diaspora now, is Indian. Most people don't know that, but it's the truth. I mean,
Yeah.
it's a huge part of our immigration now. So he was trying to show sensitivity about these things, but either got some bad advice or I don't know what happened. But
Or
the
got
whole
carried away.
the whole trip became embarrassing,
Yeah.
including rolling in the fact that they invited somebody who had some security issues related to the Sikh community in
Yeah.
India, and the reaction in India created the reaction in Canada. But if you remember at the time, the criticism didn't come from the Canadian media that was traveling with him. It started with the foreign media beating up on
Yes.
him, and
Yes,
then it was
exactly.
picked up by the Canadian media. So if that hadn't happened, he might have gotten through that reasonably well. But because third parties were weighing in and criticizing what was going on, it stuck, and it created a situation in which the Canadian media had to report it. When it got back to Canada, it didn't go particularly well, and it added in to what was going on with SNC-Lavalin to say, hey, what is this guy all about? So you go from darling to disappointment,
Yeah.
and that's what it was in 2019. And Andrew Scheer, who was one of the weaker leaders in terms of electoral appeal in this country beat him on the popular vote. Now,
Yeah.
granted, that was all because of what was happening in Western Canada. And Trudeau won the election fairly handily, not a majority, but won it fairly handily. But the bloom was well off the rose through that election campaign. Blackface didn't help. Just everything that happened, it didn't go well.
What was the core issue for people on SNC-Lavalin? Was it corruption? Was it, picking on a woman Indigenous leader? Like what did people see from that they took away to say, that's bad and it's his fault?
Hypocrisy.
Okay. Yeah.
So it was, you told us you were this, and then you did this.
Yeah.
Who are you?
Yeah.
And that's the source of the disappointment. And the blackface was another thing.
The
that
authenticity issue keeps rearing its head, doesn't it? Right? Like that's the
yeah. And he like in my time doing the participating in analyzing politics, I have not seen a political leader since probably Brian Mulroney in 1984 have the level of public adulation that Justin Trudeau had in 2015. It was an extraordinary performance. It was an incredibly well-run campaign, going from third to first and a majority, and people were totally on side with him. And I probably what happened was their expectations were so high about how he was going to be different that when he started behaving in ways that looked like not the way that he had presented himself, that the swing back was hard.
Yeah.
Poilievre's in a different situation, right? Where people's expectations of him are not that high.
Yes, that's right. So
there's no Poilievre mania like there was Trudeau mania, as big as it was for his father in 67.
But there's change mania is what you're talking about. This is a conversation I had over the break as well, which was interesting, which people are, I'm not sure, angry, I think is the word I'll choose, about the deal with the NDP. That when Canadians vote in this country and give somebody a minority government, it's for a reason. Is because we don't really love you, but we like you better than the other guys. So you're going to have a minority so we can keep a rein on you. But then he goes and signs a deal with the NDP, like that gives him a majority government, and people feel a little cheated by that. Is that just the part of the world I'm from?
It's the part of the world you're from. I don't think most people in Canada right now are sitting back thinking about how their deal works.
Okay.
But time will tell on all of this. But a very big loser in all of it could be Jagmeet Singh in the NDP.
Yeah.
Every NDP leader now has two models that they can follow. They can follow the Ed Broadbent model, or they can follow the Jack Layton model. So the progressive coalition in this country is bigger than the conservative coalition. And when the progressive conservatives, when the progressive coalition decides to get behind a single party, it wins. And Jack Layton found a way to replace the Liberal Party through the course of the 2000, up to the 2015 election, as the option for progressive voters. And they were making progress, and the Liberal Party, until they made Justin Trudeau the leader, was in the rearview mirror for most people. Yeah. And Trudeau, and you have to give him his due. I mean, him and his team resuscitated what seemed to be something that was dead in Canadian politics. Maybe dead again after the next election, by the way. Yeah. But it's kind of like Quebec separatism, though. You can't ever count it out. But Singh has decided he's going to go kind of the beautiful loser route, which was at Broadbent, which is we're going to be the voice of we're going to be the conscience of Parliament. Yes, we're going to get all sorts of policy things done on behalf of Canadians, and we will celebrate at academic enclaves and maybe union meetings about how wonderful we are and what a difference we've made to Canadians. And at the moment, though, Canadians see no difference between the two of them. So if they're going to punish one of them, they're going to punish them both. Yeah. And that's the thing about, people celebrate Ed Broadbent, a fine Canadian, was an amazing leader. I mean, a politician of conscience beyond parallel, I think, in Canadian history. I mean, very well regarded, but he lost. He lost every time. And Jagmeet Singh's in the same position. I mean, he's now set himself up. where his party, because he's not seen as a political threat, becomes irrelevant.
Yeah,
So
well,
what's going to
that's
happen in the
exactly.
next election campaign? At best, maybe they're going to split with the Liberals, but are people going to vote with the NDP now? It's hard to make that proposition. They're both going to be saying, you know, we're the best people to deliver on behalf of Canadians, and the NDP is going to try and take credit for it. The Liberals will get the credit or the blame more likely. Junior
Yes, exactly.
parties in minority governments, when they get into agreements like this, seldom do well. Jack Layton found a way when he was the leader of the party to play the game with both parties. He would side with Harper or he would side with Martin,
Exactly.
depending on what was
And
required.
increased his power rather than signing a one-off, a deal, which is, I'm with you regardless of what you do.
And there's a progressive coalition out there that's waiting for somebody to represent
Yeah.
them. And if all they can say is that we're just Liberals light,
What's the
I'm sitting here talking with certainty. I don't know. I mean, nobody
yeah.
really knows.
Okay, I
But
have
it
two.
doesn't really look like it at the moment.
I have two skill testing questions for you before we say
Okay.
goodbye. Our time has just sort of flown by. Will Donald Trump and Joe Biden be the two candidates in the US election? And will Pierre Poilievre and Justin Trudeau be the two candidates in the Canadian election?
I would say the
If you
first
were
one is,
betting.
if I was betting, if we were in the bar and we had out our regimental coins and you had out your Air Force coin and put them on the table and we'd have to bet, I would say I would bet on Biden and Trump, and I would not bet on Trudeau and Poilievre.
Yeah. So even you think Trump is going to get through this? I mean, this move to try and take him off the ballot seems to be one more thing to enhance his popularity.
Well, it'll be up to the Supreme Court to decide, and nobody knows what the decision is going to be. But
Yeah.
the truth is, he's so far ahead in the
Yeah.
Republican contest that, I mean, the media is struggling mightily to try and make it look like a contest, but it's no contest.
Yeah.
Trump is going to easily be the nominee. So
Yeah.
maybe the courts can prevent him from doing it, and that might be one outcome. But my suspicion is that probably they won't.
Yeah.
They'll let the democratic process decide things, and then
As they should.
well, pardon me. And following on that, it really is too close to call. Our polling right now shows Trump ahead by about 2, but ahead by significantly more than that in most of the swing states. But there's a fair amount of time to go. We could say the
Yes.
same thing about Trudeau, but unless there's some massive screw up on the Conservative Party's behalf, and by the way, they're entirely capable of it.
Yes, absolutely.
Unless something happens,
Yeah.
then all we're watching is the sand drift out of the sundial, and we're just getting closer to the inevitability of what's going to happen. So the question is, do you think Trudeau is that stubborn?
Right.
He's definitely stubborn, but he's not stupid.
Yeah.
Just like Brian Mulroney was definitely stubborn, but he wasn't stupid. Just like his father was definitely stubborn, but not stupid.
Yeah. But these guys make their decisions much earlier than they ever exercise them, right?
My sense, Senator, is that the more somebody claims that they're going to be doing something, the less likely they are.
Yeah, I agree with you 100%. I'm staying.
The
No,
leader doth protest too much.
Such fun talking to you, and we didn't even get to the state of media in Canada. That's going to be a whole other thing.
Oh, well, then that's me asking you questions, because you know more about that than I do.
Oh, I'm pretty sure it's there in the public polling that you're doing too. Darrell, just so great as always. And if you have not read his books like The Empty Planet, which predicted a lot of this thing about these issues that have to do with our population and our ability to sustain ourselves, and Next, which is about the future. Darrell Bricker, Global CEO of IPSOS Public Affairs, and just a font of wisdom. You are a font. Thank you.
Kind, Senator.
Thank you.
Always a pleasure. Thank you very much.
Happy New Year. We'll see you again soon. And that's it for this edition of No Nonsense with Pamela Wallin. We'll see you soon too.